welcome, everyone.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much. Welcome, everyone, to our Playful Horizons speaker series, continuing apace here. We are so excited for our guest here today, and thank you for taking the time to join us. A little bit of the usual background information. So, this is our second last, I believe, speaker series for the semester. So we have one more speaker who will be on Monday, April the 7th, and that's Jean Ketterling. And then we'll be wrapping for the term. So hopefully you'll be able to make it to the next one. As always, these interviews will be recorded and will be made available to students earlier in kind of their raw form, and then will be made available on the Faculty of Art YouTube page down the line. So if that's how you're joining, welcome. And PB does have a bit of an archive of the talks going on. So if you are interested in one other than this one, please reach out to PB and she will be able to put you with access to all of those. And I think that is all of our background homework stuff. As per usual, the talk will be recorded, and then we will turn off the recording for the Q&A session. So we'll have about a half hour of kind of formal questions from PB and myself, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So with that, PB, would you like to introduce our speaker?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Kenzie, and thanks all of you for being here. I'm really excited to welcome here to Playful Horizons Alexander Rudenshiold, a PhD student in the Department of Film and Media Studies at UC Irvine. Alex previously earned his MA in Media Culture and Technology at the University of Virginia, and his research focuses on using critical theory to understand the history and aesthetics of internet communities and subcultures, ranging from leftist Twitter to furry. His writing has appeared in Spectator and Afterimage, and he's also a touring musician and union organizer, because we can never bring anyone on this who does only one thing. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here, Alex. I know my students are very excited to chat with you. Bringing in a furry expert was, as I mentioned before we started the recording, one of the most requested speakers for the series, so we're glad you're here. To sort of kick us off, would you mind telling us a bit about yourself? What's your academic background, and what got you into studying media and games?
Yeah, well, thanks so much again for having me. It's crazy to be referred to as a furry expert. I do think it's probably objectively true at this point, but it is also still really funny. Also, thank you to people who are here. I really appreciate it. So I don't know. I think it's kind of hard to talk about how I got into this business without sort of talking first about where I come from originally, like my background growing up, like so many people in sort of this area in academia. It's really related to my sort of formative experiences. So I come from a small town in what was then rural Virginia, which is in the American South for Canadians who don't know. Just an hour away from the capital of the Confederacy, big deal. And I sort of have a couple intertwining backgrounds that informed my jump to media studies and furry studies and internet studies. So I sort of, when I started becoming self-aware as a kid, I knew there was something different about me. Obviously, this is a queer and trans games class, so I'm sure this is many people's experience. And at a certain point as a tween, maybe I realized I was gay and that kind of wasn't cool. So I had some trouble fitting in for a while because, in the rural American South, that's really not something you can be out as in public school in the late 2000s. So as a result, I was sort of not socializing as much as I could be. And I had, ended up, against my parents' wishes, getting into gaming and internet culture as a sort of alternative place to socialize, right? So my first experience of this is sort of weirdly on this old program called Flipnote, which was this DSI freeware where you can make flipbook animations, and there was a social component called Flipnote Hotana, and it's like kind of made a comeback, but I didn't really make any. I just ended up using the online service a lot, where I got into watching fan animations of things like Pokemon or Warriors or Rage comics, and sort of silly and edgy. I think the first one that comes to mind is this like flip note of a stalkerish fangirl Pikachu that was set to paparazzi by Lady Gaga, which is like incredibly gay. It's like one of the gayest things that I can think of in my mind. But yeah, that's like sort of where this starts. And then I got really into watching YouTube videos and like daily vlogs and let's plays. And this is like, again, like late 2000s, early 2010s, early. And it all led me into gaming culture in the period before Gamergate, which is sort of a different landscape, but it's pretty easy to see how it ended up there. And if people want to, I can talk about Gamergate and what that is if people don't know, but maybe that can be in the Q&A.
Yeah.
But my dad had this like old Dell laptop with a broken screen hinge from like 2003, and I would prop it up against the foot of my bed and lay on the floor and play low like RAM usage, low video usage games for like double-digit hours at a time. Ultimately, I got really into Minecraft, which is like a crazy thing to say now because there's like a Jack Black Minecraft movie coming out this week. But back then, it was a really exciting moment in gaming because Minecraft sort of represented a very subcultural, independent game that was breaking through to the mainstream in some ways. And it had, you know, the demographics of that were like way older than they are now. It was a lot of like 20-somethings, like late teens, 20-somethings, 30-somethings who were playing it, like making mods, running these sort of these Hamachi Java servers before it was cross-platform. Oh my god. And it had a very strong hacker ethos, which is also sort of like something we could talk about later if people want. But for me, a young gay boy, very far away from like accepting community, I got into this sort of the server moderation game and playing with people way older than me at the time, and felt very accepted and validated just as a human by like a community of older people who were mentoring me over VoIP, voice over IP, which I was using Mumble back then, which is like crazy. I'm like name dropping all this old shit.
The students are loving
just...
it, by the way. There's much love for the flip note and the Hamachi throwbacks.
Yeah, it's crazy. But I was just like trying to figure out how to be a person, and it led to some weird socialization. But I was exposed to a lot of like strange parts of the internet pretty young. But also back then it was kind of more of a mixed bag of what that meant, I would say. And because it leads into this far right radicalization pipeline, but I sort of had the opposite experience. But that's all to say I have like a sort of deep history with these online spaces, and many of them were full of furries and weirdos and people doing all this sort of internet subcultural stuff. And a lot of it came from just like being a young gay person and like a young queer person, and like this was the place where I found community, was in these like sort of subcultural gaming and furry spaces online. And that's not something I could find in the real world at the time. Like it's crazy like to think about now also, because it feels like very dated, but I think maybe it's coming back to that. But after that, I ended up getting my shit together and like getting into straight edge anarchist DIY punk stuff in high school, and led me down this path of like left-wing radicalization, which you know, I'm now a union organizer and like a TSA guy and like whatever. It's also informed my research in a lot of ways. So I ended up going to undergrad at like a small state school, doing English and political theory and digital humanities, and I became very interested in studying internet culture. You know, I didn't really know what I wanted to do because I graduated in the pandemic in 2020 out of undergrad, and I sort of applied to grad school on a whim, and I ended up finding that I really liked it. I basically did my master's degree online because I was like, everything was on Zoom, and writing about Twitch and platforms, and I sort of found that it was impossible to talk about the stuff without talking about gaming and Gamergate and internet culture as a whole, and how those things sort of developed into what they are today and over the course of the 2010s especially. So I ended up bringing a lot of that early life experience back into my research through this sort of like understanding and having been there. You know, I was like there in these spaces kind of right before Gamergate and left right before it, which is a crazy thing to have like checked back in on and been like, oh shit. There's like really crazy harassment campaigns and mass flagging and doxing and stuff, and you know, it's really nasty. But I sort of feel like a large part of my mission has been to say, well, it's like not everything. There is all this other stuff which is really meaningful, and I think a great example of that is furry, right? So essentially, like, I'm doing my PhD at UC Irvine in film and media studies, like PB said, and I began my application letter to my PhD with the idea, with the rule of the internet, which is the internet makes you stupid, and structuring my whole sort of inquiry into this question of like why and what does that mean? Like, what does it mean the internet makes you stupid? It's like really relative. I think it's like obviously not really true per se. But I think that was before the brain rot revolution or whatever. So I kind of think these questions are more relevant now, in a more direct way. Which I don't even think that's true, to be honest. I think that brain rot isn't necessarily making anybody stupid. But that's sort of how I got into it. And, you know, I think that basically internet studies and gaming culture are pretty much inseparable. And to do so is to do a disservice to both fields.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you. I love how everyone's journey into these spaces are always like deeply personal and like connected to all these things, but also like often share so many of these common factors of these websites or these communities and stuff. So cool. Thank you. So as PB kind of alluded to before, like in their course on trans and queer game design, there's been a lot of interest in understanding what is like critical furry studies, which is one of your areas of specialty. I know you gave a talk at the Association of Internet Researchers titled Furries Built the Internet. Could you just kind of introduce us a bit to the world of furry studies, what it means, what that looks like as an academic discipline or practice?
Yeah, so it's a growing world, let's say. It's actually, there's a lot of like really exciting new research in like studying furries. I'm excited to be a part of it. But I think there's like a few discourses that it fits into. Also, sorry if you hear noise from outside my window. But there's a few different things it fits into. Yeah, so there's fan studies, which I think is the most obvious original home for this, right? So that's going to be in journals like Transformative Works and Cultures, things like that, which sort of rely on this idea that furry is a fandom. And I think it's interesting to consider like what fandom is. And I sort of would say that fandom is a group of people who are united around an interest in a specific fan object. And there's a problem here when thinking about furry as a fandom, right? And that furries don't really have a specific fan object, right? There's no, I don't know, there's no Supernatural, there's no, BTS, there's no Homestuck, there's no specific thing which you can say that's what furries are a fan of. Instead, it's this general idea of like anthropomorphism, which is, I think, complicating, right? Because the majority of that, the sort of like fan production, which is what you would call like sort of creation of fan works, is completely original character work, original creation work. It's not fan like fan works in the traditional sense. So it's kind of a fandom, and many people call it a fandom. There's actually like a fan, like even in furry, people call it a fandom. There's a pretty famous like documentary, that's what I was looking for, called The Fandom, about furries, which people may have heard of. Well, Robin is interesting ground zero because, like, yes, but also not necessarily. And that's sort of my interest in like furry history, because there's this whole like original creation, these like original species of like alien furries that are like really important to early furry, right? That are like inspired definitely by like the Disney animation style, but is like it's also this OC stuff has been like there from the beginning in a way, which is I think also interesting. But I agree that I think that Robin Hood is like a key text for sure. But the next thing that I would sort of situate in it is queer studies, right? And I think the better place for it is in queer studies, because this question of like what is queerness, and it's this transgression of these norms of behavior and performance, and any number of different things. People take queering to be anything, which I think is sometimes good and sometimes can lead to some sort of unrigorous positivist. This is maybe a little bit too much, but anyway, whatever. This is my own beefs with the field. But
so welcome.
Furry is very much fits into this sort of idea of queerness, in that it's an intentional subversion of like what it means to be human, right? And this like performance of something which is at once human but is not, and this adoption of this persona, alternate persona, which people take on both online and in the real world, as a sort of avatar for either themselves or this idealized version of the self, or someone other than the self. And there is obviously like, I think people associate furry a lot with sexuality, and I think that's not wrong. But I think to preemptively caution people against sticking in only that route, I would encourage people to think about many other subcultures, right? I think my go-to is goth subculture, which maybe is like a little bit dated for a lot of people now, but it's a subculture people don't like. I primarily identify as sexual, but it is a highly sexualized subculture in a similar way, right? So when people are like, "Oh, furry is a fetish," it sort of relies on what I would identify as a homophobic, transphobic idea that this community, which is primarily queer and operates in a sort of queer theoretical framework, is necessarily going to be this deviant sexual thing, which certainly there is an element of that, but I would say it's not really like the most interesting part of this, or even the sort of primary part of it. But you also see a lot of people sort of refute, like, oh no, it's totally family friendly, wholesome, which is like, I think also not great, and is internalized homophobic, transphobic, because whatever. Anyway, it's a response to this sort of repressive norms that are saying, oh, well, we can't have like queer sexuality, right? Which is impressed upon furry. So the way that these two things are taken up in academic discourse is often through this idea of posthumanism, which again, I apologize, this is like a little bit heady, but there's this newish book that's the only book on furry called Fan Identities in the Furry Fandom, which I think is interesting, but it takes this very post-human approach, which is saying furries are necessarily transcending the human experience, right? They are like taking on these like hybrid animal human identity, which I would say probably also would include technology. This is like sort of the first in like book length foray into this. And I would argue it's not post-human, and I think that makes it more interesting in many ways, because I think it's a queer human practice of sort of subversion and becoming, in the sort of sense that people are using, like furries often use like their personae and the community to become like better selves. And there's a great article, which might be hard to find, PB, I'm sorry for the chat, but I can send it, by the scholar Hazel Zaman, and it's talking about, it's more recent, and this is the newer strain of like sort of critical furry studies, which is sort of arguing that furry is a way for queer people to live like with more life, to live more vividly and to live more authentically themselves, and to become that in a sort of social organization, right, which which disincentivizes people from living as their like queer selves and expressing themselves. So it's a great article. I would really recommend it. I think it's probably the best piece on furry right now. Also, great job, PB.
Is that the one? Okay,
Killed
cool.
it. That is the one. Yeah.
Love it.
But yeah, I think it's actually a really, really good piece on it. And if anyone wants the PDF, let me know. So my entry into furry, though, into all of these discourses through media studies, right? I'm like a media scholar. I'm interested in internet media as such, and I'm interested in like sort of theoretically thinking about it. And that leads me to this question: is furry media? And I think the answer is pretty much yes. There's all these different ways that furries use internet media and digital media, as well as like traditional art and costuming, which are also sort of in this framework of thinking about media, that they constitute their identities through. So furries are constituting themselves and their identity through media. And I think that makes it like a really interesting way to think about it as a media practice, as a queer media practice of resistance against sort of heteronormative, cisnormative society, which, yeah. And so you mentioned that presentation I gave at AIR, and there's this really deep historical connection between furry and the internet, which stems from sci-fi conventions, which is where furry originates, in the late 70s and early 80s, where you have these sort of side conventions where furries are getting together, or at that point called the funny animal fandom, which is these people who are really interested in anthropomorphic animals in anime. This is actually like one of the places where anime comes to the United States for the first time, as well as in like American media as well. A lot of this is also related to the underground comics scene of the 70s and 80s. And they also end up, because they're in this space, being people with a lot of tech knowledge, like technological knowledge, like radio and computer hobbyists, early microcomputer hobbyists who are building these sorts of kits, DIY style, and connecting to each other over telephone lines. So the way that they would do this is through these things called bulletin board systems, which are early DIY home computing, where basically you can make a post, and then you can retrieve all the posts that have been made within a certain time period. And it doesn't really rely on internet the way we think about it today. It's this entirely DIY setup, basically. You don't have an internet service provider. You don't have like Comcast. You're not paying them for your internet. You're just like connecting it to your phone, and then like your computer to your phone, and it'll print out a long list of everyone's posts for the day, which is, again, hilarious to think about. But in this time period, also, you'll see, and we get monitors as well, but it's only text-based. There's no images, it's crazy to think about furry without any visual art, right? Like over the internet. Obviously, there's still like material physical art, but a lot of the sort of fursona creation stuff would be text-based, because computers couldn't transfer images. And I think that like gets to also this idea that like it's not just like this image culture, it's this larger media culture. Eventually furries end up creating a lot of like things we think about on the internet. They like, the first webcomic is a furry webcomic, and I'll just post a link to the archive thing here if you want an example of it. It's called Thaddeus Fox, but it's really not very good, I think. But it's really interesting to think like webcomics are a creation of like furries online in like the 90s, right? But you end up getting furries who know a lot about the internet, imbricating themselves in tech industry, right? You have in the 90s these big tech companies, the dot-com bubble, going to furry conventions and recruiting people off the con floor because they just like have all this experience, which is really uncommon, and you're more likely to find somebody who's like experienced internet dev at a furry convention than like anywhere else. So like Sun Microsystems famously does this. If you look at the scholarship also from the 80s and 90s, like this early internet scholarship, you'll find mentions of furries like all over the place. I think my favorite example of it is in Sherry Turkle's like first two books. Like she mentions like things which people who we would now call furries, but like she doesn't really know what to make of them, and interviewees will like mention them, that they're these people who are like role playing as anthropomorphic animals, and like they're everywhere. And it's sort of this shameful thing, but it's just to say that like furries have been everywhere online from the start, and it's led to this sort of interesting pervasive myth of like furries running the internet, which is kind of where I get into this history thing, right? Because in a sense, furries kind of do have this very deep history with internet technology, that comes from this infrastructural background of having built internet like communications for like to get in touch with each other outside of conventions, which then leads to this very like direct route of being involved in the tech industry. And it as until very recently, I think like Microsoft had like official like furry like community groups for people who work there, you know, like in their official Slack and stuff. So it's like pretty well known, but it's also not totally arbitrary. I don't know, but I think that answered the question.
Yes.
Of the sort of broader thing of furry studies, and then my interest in it.
Yeah. No, that was fantastic. I think that does a great job sort of painting this very specific history, and I will shout out again for the students here. One of the texts we read a brief segment of is Avery Dame Griff's The Two Revolutions, which talks about kind of early trans and queer histories and how those were crucial to some of those first like bulletin board sites that Alex was talking about. But this is I think another component of that that's really fascinating, and the fact that those connections have lingering implications for internet culture today. Yeah, I think that's really really important.
Yeah, and Avery was actually one of the other people on the panel that I organized for AIR.
Oh, hell yeah.
When I did this furry talk a couple years ago. So yeah, great book. Can't recommend enough.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. So I think this brings up a really good question, which is, you do a lot of work in game studies, but you've written, I think, predominantly maybe about the internet generally, from content moderation on Twitch, and you've written about popular Twitch streamers. I know there was one incident there where, was it your master's thesis got retweeted by Hassan Piker, and you ended up like briefly famous for a day and all that. Could you tell us a little bit about how you move between like media and game and internet research, and how that shapes your thinking?
Yeah, like I said earlier, I kind of feel like these things can't really be separated from each other that cleanly.
Yeah.
I think Twitch is a great example of this. Yes, I wrote my master's thesis on Hassan because my other sort of like main project is about like left-wing politics on the internet. But Twitch is a great example because it functions so much around gaming cultural conventions. It sort of transforms a lot of political formation activities into sort of let's play format, similar to, I would say, like couch co-op, like you're watching somebody play a game with a bunch of your friends, right? Or it's not really couch co-op, it's just like watching like an older sibling play. I'm an only child, so I'm imagining what that's like. It's very pastoral. I don't know. But it's this sort of like community watching somebody play, and except instead of playing, it's like the news, which in a sense sort of like harkens back to like the pre-multi-channel TV era, where everyone's watching the same like broadcast of the news at the same time. But Hassan is maybe the best example of this. Until recently, he was sort of the #1 political streamer. There's like this right-wing guy now who's made the transition from gaming called Asmongold, who's like famous for having like roaches all over his house. But he's like become more popular, but I would say he's not really a politics only streamer, or primarily politics streamer historically. But essentially a lot of the tactics and language and norms established by gaming creators end up being used and transformed to talk about politics online. And I mentioned Gamergate before as well, but Gamergate is an example of this, in that like these sorts of gaming communities sort of became a vector for like right-wing politics in a way which many people associate with, or like attribute to like Donald Trump winning the 2016 presidential election, which I think is maybe an overstatement. But there's some truth in the fact that the sort of irreverent rhetoric that gets taken up by many like online supporters of that campaign is derived from this sort of gaming cultural milieu, right? And the sort of tactics, the tactics of this baggage also, harassment campaigns, which consist of like mass flagging and brigading, which are, these are also adapted and mainstreamed in many ways. So in the case of Hassan, that the thing that I was writing about, or that I have actually an article coming out about this like thing of Crackergate, which is this moment when cracker, the word, becomes banned, on Twitch as like an anti-white hate speech slur, which is crazy to think about for many people who have been online for longer than that. It's like a historically not like very offensive. And like it's like on TV in Norman Lear shows like in the Jeffersons in the 70s, and like nobody cares and it's funny. So whatever. But basically these like right-wing mass flaggers turn cracker into a slur by like taking advantage of content moderation systems on Twitch, which is a tactic directly derived from the sort of Gamergate era, in which like 4chan and Kiwi Farms and these different like right-wing holes on the internet end up coordinating these campaigns against any number of different gaming journalists, because of what we would now call woke, right? Like woke in gaming, which is it was kind of surreal at the time. And it sort of has this continuing cultural effect. But anyway, we see this in the mainstream of politics now as well. You can think about like Aiden Ross having Trump on his live stream, or again like Asmongold's political takes. I think a large part of the downside of this let's playing of politics is that it sort of transforms this sort of more serious or impactful thing of politics and political debate into a sort of content creator logic, which incentivizes outrage and all of these and like just the production of a lot of different things, the production of like lots and lots of content that gets clicks rather than sort of going for deeper analysis. And I don't think that's like original to the internet. I think that comes also with again, in the broadcast sort of zone and the 24-hour news cycle. But I think that that's something which is sort of accelerated by this new form of political discourse. But that's pretty far from gaming, but I think it actually like it follows through pretty cleanly. And I think now, especially, we see like gaming creators taking up politics again post Gamergate in a more serious way, just because there's like a model for how to do that, which is pretty accessible.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was like blood.
No, that was amazing. Thank you. Like, I think, yeah, you've helped illustrate, I think, how fuzzy the boundaries between all of these things are. And like, actually, we can probably draw like some pretty zigzaggy but straight-ish lines between things like Twitch and gaming. And yeah, that like more mainstream political discourse. Okay, we do have another question for you, but PB, do we want to pivot to audience questions, just looking at the time?
I think we can ask the last question just to give
Sure.
those of you here in the audience enough time to prep your own questions. So, and yeah, we can try to hurry to the student questions, but I do think folks will want to hear a little bit about the next part here. So, as Alex is chatting through the next question, if y'all want to start forming your own, feel free to put them in the chat here on the sidebar or up in the speaker questions channel. And as always, upvote the questions with a little reaction if it's a question you also have, so we know which ones to pick.
Perfect. Okay, so while you are formulating your questions, we wanted to pivot a little bit because, as PB mentioned in your bio, you're also a musician and an audio engineer. You have many hats. And a number of students in our class, and I would imagine in the audience, are also doing audio production as part of their degree programs. So could you tell us a little bit about your musical practice and how do you balance research and creative practice, if that is
Yeah.
possible?
I don't think balancing anything with like research and academia is possible, but we all try, right? But I think, well, okay, my background in music, like I mentioned earlier, is from like sort of DIY punk stuff, which is very scrappy. It's very sort of unpolished in a way which is aesthetically appealing, right? And I think the like the I guess advice. I'm interpreting this as an advice question. I don't know. The way that I have like made this work, and I think somewhat successfully, is to not just think about like writing music or like playing an instrument as the creative portion of like audio production, of like making music. It's all parts of this process which are creative, right? So like I said, in like DIY spaces, you're working with limited resources. You're working with sort of like low quality mics or like recording equipment, and you have to make it work and make it work in a way which is like still appealing and interesting and unique and discernible. And part of how you can do that is by thinking about the same as everything else, by thinking about the ways that when you're mixing or you're doing this engineering, that you can make those constraints work for you. And so like for me, that's like incorporating a lot of noise or like lo-fi aesthetics into the sort of background of things, and adding lots of sort of spatial or like time effects, because it can like mask a lot of the lower like quality production into being like a stylistic choice. And I don't think that you should like, I don't think people should like do it if they have I mean you can, I don't know, but I would just say that like there's all these different ways that people approach making like audio art. Noise comes to mind, but field recordings, like all these like plunderphonics, I don't know, all these different things which are like really abrasive or really minimal, and they're like very interesting aesthetics, and incorporating those things into the process, not just of recording or not just writing, but also of recording and mixing and the sort of like after the fact production, I think is a really important way to make a sound that's uniquely yours, but also something that doesn't necessarily have to conform to the sort of traditional standards of like what music should sound like, and in a way that it's still like pretty acceptable and people will find interest in. So I don't know, lean into the noise. That's what I do. That's what like all of my music leans into the noise, leans into it being recorded in like a living room somewhere, and I think that's cool, personally.
Inclined to agree, and I think, yeah, it's a good reminder
If
that
people want,
we can work with the means that we have.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and I think like if people want recommendations for audio plugins, Isotope Trash 2 is incredible. And then I don't know, I love the Waves Factory cassette plugin. And then I don't know, those are my favorite two sort of like always on plugins.
Amazing for the specific recommendations. Thanks for that, Alex.
Yeah, you can find them online in places that you don't have to pay for them as well. So.
Yeah, perfect. Amazing. Well, we have a couple of questions coming in from students now, so we're gonna kind of take these as they come, and feel free to pop in with your own questions and react if somebody asks a question that's one you also have. We'll start with this question from: do you think that the general discourse / vibe of internet fandoms shifted over the pandemic? I've seen so much more negativity surrounding general fandoms, people arguing rather than appreciating their chosen object, and that makes it hard for me to engage.
I think that's an interesting question, and I think that there was a larger vibe shift that happened during the pandemic, honestly. but I mean, I think that that affects obviously sort of like internet communities and fandoms included. And but I think a lot of that shift also had to do with the change in, bringing it back to politics, the sort of tenor of political discourse, right? In which we see this sort of incentivization of like public crashing out, as people say now, or like these public debates, arguments, like really vitriolic, in a way which I think is mostly bad. Not that I think we should always be like hug boxing online, but I think that the sort of like the complete like breakdown of like respectful debate or whatever has like affected everything. And the way that that has affected fandoms, I think, is fandoms primarily can constitute themselves online, and we see this shift from like how to get engagement from, you know, your sort of like more traditional types of like artistic creation to discourse, right? So we see this like really vitriolic discourse prioritized in algorithms, which becomes a way that like it creates an incentive, like a feedback loop of incentivization to continue doing these sorts of like discoursey posts. Obviously, like again, like I am enmeshed in discourse as an academic, right? Like, and I think everybody should be enmeshed in some amount of discourse as like a responsible citizen or consumer or whatever. But the sort of like internecine debates that have developed over the past few years, and I think really got like accelerated by COVID and like everyone being at home on their phones all the time. I think that's like definitely new, and or at least like a new development in like a longer practice. And I think it largely has to do, I think, with like engagement farming, honestly.
Interesting.
But it's still hard. It's hard to engage with it. I agree.
Yeah. There's a kind of a related question down at the bottom that I'll upvote about like other ways that you think that furry communities have changed since like the early 2000s to now. Anything else that kind of stands out?
Well, yeah, I think that the biggest change is that it's like significantly larger now. Like it's significantly larger, and it's like way less identifying with publicly. But like when I got into furry, and before then even more so, like there were significantly fewer furries, and you can see like the change in that by the increase in like convention attendance, right? So you have like tens of thousands of people attending like individual furry conventions now, like every year, and there's like, you know, 40 or 50 in the United States alone, right? It's huge. That was not the case in the early 2000s or in the 90s, where there's like two. You know, you've got conference, you've got further confusion, and you've got like FurCon. Like there's like three big conventions, you know, big conventions with a few hundred people at them each. Now it's huge, and I think that's the biggest change. Another thing that I think has changed in the past 10 years, 15 years, is the sort of cottage industry of like furry creative practice. So we see this development, especially in like fursuit making, of people creating like sort of businesses to do that, and those being more and more widespread. I think this is largely also in a response to the growing size of the furry community. But like that's like actually like pretty important in that. Whereas if you look at like photos of old furry conventions in like the 90s, early 2000s, you'll see a lot of like DIY fursuits. People have made their own. They don't look that good, you know. They're something that somebody made out of like sort of like interest in embodying this thing. And now mostly you'll see people commission them for like large amounts of money, which I actually see that it connects to a different question in the chat about this belief of furries being rich, right? And I think there's actually two questions here, because like the furry art is a get rich quick scheme. I think is like also it's related but different. So the history of like furries being rich has to do actually with this tech history that I'm talking about, right? Or that I talked about earlier, because tech in the 90s is very lucrative. You have these furries who get into it and like end up making actually a good amount of money and creating this sort of like techno culture, wherein furries get really involved in tech. So in a sense, yes, there are a lot of wealthy furries because there's a lot of very prominent furries who are involved in technology as like an industry. However, furry is also huge, and the most visible people in furry are going to be the people with the most money, generally speaking, right? They're going to have the flashiest fursuits. They're going to have the flashiest art. They're going to have the most art because they can afford to commission the most art, right? So these are the people you're going to see the most, right? So I would say generally, no, furries are not like super rich. But there is a subset who have like a lot of means because they're involved in like high earning sectors, and I think that that's something which should be open to critique, right? The sort of like class dynamic of furry I think is really interesting and sort of weird compared to many other subcultures. I think I don't know that I know enough to really make that statement like completely affirmatively, but yeah, I think that's real. As far as the get rich quick thing, I think there's just like a lot of like there's a lot of commissions in furry. Like people are wanting to commission art. And I don't think you're getting rich off of furry art. There are people who make a living off of it, but it's definitely a way to make a quick buck. I know plenty of MFAs who have taken their fair share of DL furry commissions. It's just like there's people who are willing to pay for the creation, the visual creation or reproduction of their like alternate persona, right? You know, so if it was you and you're commissioning art of your sort of like chosen self online, probably willing to spend some money on it, I would imagine. So I think it's the personal element of it that makes people really commission a lot of art. So it's definitely an industry. Anyway, whatever. Next question. I hope that was okay.
Absolutely. And there's a related question here, just from asking if you know anything specifically about the furry community playing a role in the development of the game industry. And then in the parenthetical here, possibly beyond getting hired as programmers during the .com bubble, which I think is, yeah, again, that sort of connection that we associate like historically with, you know, furry equals programmer equals, yeah, these associations that people have.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know enough about like gaming industry furry engagement. Obviously, like there are elements of the gaming industry that at least cater to furries. I mean, I think it's pretty common to hear the term furry bait thrown around about like anthropomorphic animal characters. I think Fortnite comes to mind. Like the amount of like Fortnite skin shipping I see on my Twitter timeline is a little crazy. But I don't know enough about like furries playing a role in game development, like the development of the games industry rather. What I will say is that there's a really, really cool independent furry game dev scene. And I think a lot of people have seen a lot or played a lot of games from this. I think like Undertale Deltarune stuff is like sort of furry in a way, which like is taken up as really furry a lot of the time. But like Night in the Woods is another pretty big game from this sort of zone. And you know, I wrote a piece about this game Backbone, which is now called Tales Noir, but that's like a furry game which is really good, and got some pretty good press. And then there's this whole, honestly, I really want to write about furry visual novels. I think like queer furry visual novels are super interesting, and there's like a huge scene around it because it's like pretty low barrier to entry. But it's there's a lot of like expression of like sort of like wanting to get away from like being human in them, which I think is really fascinating in a time when like it feels maybe more guilty than ever to be human. I sort of write about that in the Tales Noir thing, but Yeah, I don't know enough about it, but there's a super cool independent game scene. If people want recommendations, I'm happy to hand out more. Um, and I think it's increasingly prominent as well. Like you see a lot of stuff from this scene online and getting more popular as indie games continue to rise in stature.
We played around a good bit with RenPy, which is a visual novel tool, earlier this semester, and yeah, I'd say a solid 50% of the various plugins and extensions and frameworks and things that I end up recommending to my students were created by furry visual novelists interested in these specific tools for their own making. No, that's fantastic. I think we have time maybe for one more question. So there's an upvoted question here from who asks, do you think the increased popularity of the business of commissioned fursuits that are quite expensive is now serving as a barrier for people who want to get into the community? Now that the polished commissioned fursuits are more the norm, is there any sort of stigma or pushback on DIYing your own fursuits, or is this still accepted practice?
I think it's a good question. It's a really good question, and I think yes and no. So on the one hand, I think also should clarify that most furries by a large margin don't have fursuits, even among furry convention attendees. So you don't need a fursuit to be a furry, and you don't even need a fursona to be a furry, although most furries have some kind of fursona type thing. However, I think that a lot of people view the fursuit as a sort of like apex of furry engagement, which I think is maybe not totally wrong, but so people will view like the high price of like a commissioned professional fursuit as like a barrier to entry, and I think that's real. Like it's definitely intimidating to think like, oh, like if I want to get into this, like really get into it, I need to spend like 15 grand on this like costume, which is a lot, right? Like that's like unreasonable, I think, in a lot of ways, but it's also like a really like high skill and high effort like production. It's like an artistic production, so I think it's like not actually unreasonable in many ways. But yeah, I think it's to that point. I think it is actually still very like acceptable to build your own fursuit, although I think it's just less common, especially as there's more and more people who are producing fursuits like semi-professionally out of their homes mostly. Although if you look at a lot of those fursuits, in my opinion, a lot of them also don't look that good. So you have like different tiers of like what that looks like. I'm being judgy, but whatever. I would much like scrappy fursuit to like some you know. And I think that in general, like furry art as a whole is still very like open to amateurism. I mean, like you can look at my profile picture on here. It's like just like a doodle, you know, like people will like express themselves anyway, anyhow. And you know, I think that is something which furry is very invested in. But again, like the sort of like highest value like stuff is going to float to the top because it's the stuff with the most financial backing generally. Also, yeah, Carpet Sample is crazy. Also, like right-winger stuff, you know, like there's a lot of that, like, again, like the most incendiary or most like expensive stuff floats to the top, but it does not really represent the norm, right? And I think that's the like thing we always have to remember, not just with furry, but with pretty much any kind of subculture, especially queer subcultures, because, you know, media will love to cover like, oh, look at these like queer people who are like also crazy right wingers, or like, look at these like really expensive things that are super ornate. Isn't it crazy people spend money on this? Like, those are the kinds of things which, again, fit into this, I guess, this theme of this talk, which has been like this sort of like engagement farming, which has sort of taken over a lot of the internet. And, you know, I think that like X.com is a good example of like how that's institutionalized, right? But anyway, yeah, Carpet Sample's crazy. Don't look that up, folks, unless you want to see something crazy.
easiest way to get everyone to Google something is to tell them, don't look at this, as insane.
I know.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to chat with us, Alex. This has been a really exciting conversation touching on tech history, queer subculture, all the things we're here to learn about. So we're going to sign off the recording now, sorry in advance for this. As of last season, we've been doing this thing where we're going to ask you to do your favorite sign off to end the video. And I know we gave you everything else, like questions in advance and everything, but we're going to make you do this on the spot because we didn't give anyone else a warning either.
Ooh.
So whatever your favorite sign off is, feel free to say it now, and then that'll end the video.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and ring the bell as well if you want updates.
Perfect.
I don't know.